Good morning to everyone joining. We will be starting in just a couple of minutes and give everyone some time to sign in. I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning to all of those joining us from the United States, and a very good evening to friends and colleagues joining from South Asia. My name is Brigitte Schuker, and I am a research associate with the Simpson Center, as well as the managing editor of South Asian Voices, an online policy platform that features analysis on the security, economics, and politics of South Asia. I'm delighted to welcome you to our South Asian Voices webinar this morning, where we will be discussing key connectivity projects in South and Central Asia, their progress thus far, and how the rhetoric surrounding each project has matched the reality. From the start, I would like to note for our audience that to keep this conversational and to get to as many audience questions as we can in the hour we have this morning, that we will be taking questions throughout the discussion and incorporating them throughout. So if you're joining for the Zoom webinar, you can just send along questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please do feel free to send a question whenever you have one, and we'll try to get to as many audience questions as we can. This conversation follows a South Asian Voices series in which the contributors from our panel this morning looked at 4 major infrastructure projects: Chabahar Port in Iran, Gwadar Port in Balochistan, Pakistan, the International North-South Transport Corridor, as well as the Turkmenistan-Afghanistan-Pakistan-India, or TAPI pipeline. As contributors discussed in their thesis, and as we will dive into more this morning, each of these projects has been touted for potential to promote economic growth and interconnectivity across the region. However, many have run into practical obstacles on the ground, ranging from local opposition to challenges coordinating amongst multiple partners and countries, to conflict and instability. In the conversation this morning, we will be focusing on 2 central questions. What are the gaps between the promises for the project and the reality? And what impact does this have on the geopolitical goals and relationships that often frame these projects? To discuss these questions and many more, I am delighted to be joined by a stellar panel of experts who focus on these topics this morning. We have with us today Sumitha Narayananputi, an adjunct researcher at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, as well as a Leverhulme Doctoral Fellow in the Center for Grand Strategy at King's College London. I am also joined by Aisha Malik, a doctoral candidate and visiting faculty member at the School of Politics and International Relations at Quaid-i-Azam University in Islamabad, as well as Soraya Parani, a research analyst at Vancouver Coastal Health, and finally, my Simpson colleague, Navard Chalikian, a non-resident fellow at the Simpson Center, who focuses on Russian foreign policy in the South Caucasus region. So I'll start by asking an opening question for each of our panelists to respond to before moving into some additional questions and a broader discussion. As noted in the beginning, we will be interweaving audience questions throughout, so please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send any questions if you're joining for the Zoom session this morning. So to start, as each of our panelists looked at a different infrastructure project for their analysis on SAV, I would like each of them to briefly discuss the project they looked at its progress thus far, and the core challenges the project has encountered in its implementation. And finally, if each of our panelists could comment on an aspect of the project that is often overlooked by casual observers. As we only have an hour this morning, I'll ask each of our panelists to keep their initial responses brief, as I'm sure this will bring up a number of issues that we can explore in greater depth throughout the conversation. And we'll try to get to as many questions about this from the Q&A and the discussion later. So to start with, Aisha, if you would like to start us off about your work on the Gwadar Port project.
Yeah, sure. Hi, good morning to everyone in the United States of America, and good evening to the audiences from Pakistan and other parts of the world, and good afternoon as well. So thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to participate in this. And the project which I have worked upon is an infrastructural plan which falls under the greater umbrella of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, basically, which is an initiative taken by Chinese government, and they are outlaying basically the infrastructural plans through Gwadar, and they're trying to connect this region on the whole, and they're trying to connect actually Gwadar to Central Asia, to Afghanistan, and that's about it. It's in the second phase, which is the medium-term phase. The first one was early harvest project, and third one would be the long-term phase. So the second phase, the medium phase, which we are right now in, the Gwadar port right now is planned to be completed by 2025. And the core challenges which this project is facing right now are regarding the governance issues, and those governance issues are related to all the possible domains, the political, the economic, and the strategic. And one aspect which is left out by the casual readers, and which I've tried to work upon in my work, in my project, is the socio-cultural aspect of developmental projects, which tends to alienate the locals or the natives. So I have emphasized on this point precisely. That's pretty much about my project.
Thank you, Aisha. And moving on then to our next port project, Sumita, would you be able to go ahead and Chabahar?
Thank you, Brigitte. I mean, thanks to Stimson and the South Asian Voices for putting this panel and the series together. And I actually look forward to learning from my fellow panelists, given just how many interdependencies are there between our work itself. To start off on Chabahar, it is located in Iran's southeastern province of Sistan and Balochistan, one of the country's most underdeveloped regions. And unlike Bandar Abbas, the other port we hear of constantly, Chabahar is a deep sea port, and it has direct access to the Indian Ocean region. And it is located outside of the Strait of Hormuz, which frees it from the geopolitics of the choke point. Now, another advantage that Iran looks for through this project is that it's heavily reliant on Dubai, which is a major re-export hub for its goods. So weaning itself away from Dubai is another option that Chabahar presents. The development of Chabahar into like a transshipment hub sort of starts off when, Iranian president at the time in 2003, Mohammad Khatami, during his visit to India, makes the proposal. And it's interesting for the Indians because this port gives it an alternate route into Afghanistan by bypassing Pakistan, where it's denied similar access or has complicated access. It takes another decade at least before the three players, India, Iran, and Afghanistan, actually get together to talk about it again. And interestingly, this is in 2012 when the Obama administration, the US, has just imposed the harshest sanctions against Iran that the country's ever seen. But the Obama administration gives tacit support, a quiet blessing to the project because it impinges on Afghanistan's economic stability, and that's the rationale that everyone talks about. Following the nuclear deal in 2016, you see India and Iran signing a bilateral contract, moving ahead in certain portions of the different parts of this project, including the trilateral connectivity aspect of Afghanistan. But we know within the same year, you have Donald Trump elected in Washington, and the narrative flips immediately, and you have by the next year sanctions reimposed. And that, of course, really widens this gap between the project's visions and realities. The challenges, of course, are many, as I detail in the piece, but just flagging three important things. First, with the Iran-US rivalry, amping up again, you don't have financial options available, financing options available to Chabahar. It's running out. Banks, foreign companies, businesses, really no one wants to touch it at this point. So that's difficult for the stakeholders who are trying to get this port going. Second, India is a close partner of Washington, and this complicates how India has to strategize to keep the port alive, even as it's doing business with Washington, who, which is a very important partnership as China's presence is also growing in India's own neighborhood. And navigating that, essentially trying to get, sanctions waiver for the port takes a while, it works out, but you don't see on the ground, you don't see confidence growing on the port project. A final thing amongst these challenges, I think what's interesting to flag is that the India-Iran relationship itself is a bit difficult. It's complicated, especially on economic projects. And you see that story unfolding here as well. So ultimately you have Iran and with India making do with what they have. And at this point, the priority essentially is to build regional buy-in on the port. Ports need cargo. Chabahar, with its challenges, needs a lot more. So that's the plan now, using Central Asian players involving Russia, the different transit networks, as we'll discuss here today, to essentially get more cargo for the port. Moving on, just because you said, it's a few aspects that are interesting. And I think I generally view the sport through the Indian lens. And what I find two realistic assumptions that I have to push back on is, first, Iran will be linking the sport to Pakistani ports, Gwadar, Karachi, etc. It's a regional initiative at this point, just given how the challenges are. And so you will see this, this linking happening. Two, on China, you will see at some point in future, you will have Chinese investments and shipping lines, using the port. Of course, it's important to also ask why it hasn't done so yet, as I also entail in the piece. I leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Sumita. Moving on to Navard.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to speak at the webinar. Before I begin, I would like to mention that I have co-written this article with Yahya Tashjan, who is an analyst from Lebanon. So I'm going to speak about the International North-South Transport Corridor. To begin with, if you want to transport freight from Europe all the way to India, the traditional route, as we know, is the Suez Canal. But now there is an alternative to that, which is INSTC, and I will use this abbreviation for the International North-South Transport Corridor. In fact, the first train via INSTC departed already from Finland just a couple of weeks ago and is on its way to India as we speak. It is estimated to get to its destination in Mumbai, cutting down the transit time in half compared to the Suez route and reducing transport cost for about 30%. So if previously it took about 40 days, now it's going to take about 25 days for the freight to reach its destination. INSTC is a major connectivity project founded by Russia, India, and Iran in 2012. Other important states that joined later are Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. It is a 7,200 kilometer long multi-mode network comprised of railroad and water routes and aims to connect Indian Ocean with the Persian Gulf, Russia, and Europe. So is it operational? Well, to some extent it is, but it has a lot of technical financial difficulties as well as geopolitical impediments, such as the Western sanctions on Iran, as my colleague has already mentioned, and there's some geopolitical conflicts among the member states, as well as security issues. And it actually has a big rival, not only one, but a number of alternative competing connectivity projects, the biggest of which is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. So INSTC is designed to boost trade and connectivity, but it has first and foremost strategic and geopolitical implications. And I will just briefly mention the interests of the countries involved. So Russia is interested in this route because it wants to connect with the Gulf region, with India and Europe. Of course, it wants to boost its trade, wants to strengthen the Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union. It wants to develop adjacent Russian regions, as well as counter Chinese influence in the region. As for India, this project allows India to balance the growing influence of China and BRI projects that are in competition. And India also aims to connect with Russia, Central Asia, and especially with Afghanistan, bypassing hostile Pakistan and China. So this is where Iran plays an important role because of its geographic location and offers the best and shortest route for India to achieve these destinations. So as my colleague already has mentioned, India has invested heavily in Chabahar Port in Iran, and by that it wants to leave Pakistan's Gwadar competitive port out of competition as much as it's possible, which is a hard thing to do actually, and to counter basically China's strategic encirclement policy the way India views it. As for countries in the South Caucasus, which are also important in this background, Azerbaijan is an important partner in INSTC because it connects Iran with Russia, and it is now actively constructing the missing links in the railway. However, at the same time, Armenia offers an alternative route to that of Azerbaijan that's just going in parallel and has been building its own north-south transport corridor that runs from Iran to Georgia, from Iran to Georgia. So India has recently expressed interest to connect Chabahar Port with Armenia, with which India's interests may align, because the Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Pakistan alliance has been acting not only against Armenia, but also to some extent has been supporting Pakistan against India in Kashmir and other places. So there is also an interest of Turkey that has an aspirations to have greater influence in Central Asia, which can also run counter to some extent to India's interests. For these reasons, India, Iran, and Georgia, and as well as other stakeholders are interested in the Armenian section of the route. To conclude, so if INSTC is a success, as I said, it has a lot of hurdles in it. It will make a major difference in global trade and in the region. Most importantly, it can become a geopolitical rival to the bigger elephant in the room, which is the Chinese BRI. And the key member states, India, Russia, and Iran, as well as, by the way, Central Asian states, have a certain interest in balancing Chinese influence in this region through this connectivity project. So that's a very brief description, and thank you for your attention. I'll look forward to questions.
And finally, Soraya, if you would like to discuss the TAPI pipeline project.
Of course. Thank you so much, Brigida, and thank you to the Stimson Center for including me today. The project that I'm going to be overviewing today is the TAPI pipeline, and I'm going to primarily focus through the lens of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan has always been a country that's been a strategic location and a link for cross-border connectivity. One of these many ambitious projects right now is the TAPI pipeline project. This is the Turkmenistan-Afghanistan-Pakistan-India pipeline project. This pipeline would be 1,600 kilometers long and would bring oil from Turkmenistan via Afghanistan to both India and Pakistan. At full capacity, this pipeline will transport 33 BCM of natural gas every single year. The split would be 47.5% would be going to both India and Pakistan, with 5% of it actually going to Afghanistan. However, Afghanistan would also obtain transit fees for being the connectivity between the states. The TAPI pipeline was first proposed over 30 years ago through a memorandum of understanding between Turkmenistan and Pakistan for a pipeline that would cut across Afghanistan. Specifically during that time, the Taliban were the ones that were negotiating on behalf of Afghanistan and part of the pipeline conversation. Obviously, since then, there's been a lot of delays due to the instability in the country, and more recently, the leaders of Turkmenistan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan have signed agreements to cooperate on the project, both in 2002 and then also brought in India in 2010. However, the serving for the project did not officially begin until 2018. Today, not much has changed. The project is still being delayed due to the changing relationships within the region and the rising insecurity and increasing violence within Afghanistan.
Thank you, Soraya. So just a reminder to our audience that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature to send them along. I have a few more questions of my own for our panelists, but also would also like to invite our panelists to ask questions of each other if they have any to follow up with. But to start, maybe we can sort of move from the local and then move into kind of these bigger geopolitical questions. So my next question builds up a topic that, Aisha, you looked at quite closely in your analysis, but applies to each of the infrastructure projects. And that is the question of the role of local level political dynamics and how the project is being developed and carried out. So each of these sort of multi-million or multi-billion dollar projects is brought up often in high-level political discussions or advertised as symbolic of geopolitical ties. But how have political dynamics at the local level impacted the project, and to what extent have politics or communities on the micro level been able to have leverage or influence on these sort of multi-country projects? So Aisha, perhaps if you would like to start, since this is something you looked at closely in your South Asian Voices article, but then we can open it up to the rest of the panel as well.
Yeah, sure. Actually, thank you for all the insights. And I'm in a position now where I can incorporate all your projects into my discussions. And I can see that from the local level governance, how it's going to reflect itself into the regional level governance and then the international level governance. So at the local level, we see that Gwadar project, which is, of course, located in the southwest Balochistan province of Pakistan. And it's a deep sea port, and it has the potential of integrating not one, two, three, multiple regions. Southeast Asia, if they invest in Gwadar, then Gwadar has the potential for Middle Eastern countries if they bring their oil refineries here, since Saudi Arabia is one of the leading oil exporter to China. And then we have the potential for connecting Uzbekistan and Central Asian states with Gwadar. So there are multi-parties which are involved, and there are multiple layers of governance as well. We see that there is local governance, there is federal government, and then there is Chinese parties which are involved in the decision-making process of the Gwadar project. So going through these multi-tiers, we see that there arrives a problem of alienating the local communities, because whatever is going on, although all the developmental discourses, they're always built on this idea that development would be inclusive and it would bring great prosperity for the locals. But unfortunately, in this local, federal, and Chinese tiers of decision-making processes, the locals or the natives have not been made the stakeholders, and that's why they have been exhibiting a lot more of grievances, and we have seen a lot of insurgencies. Although this has been a problem for as many years as CPAC and BRI has been discussed in Pakistan. But recently, just 3 days back, Prime Minister of Pakistan visited Gwadar, and he initiated this project of reconciliation, of rehabilitation of these insurgent groups. But the point is that Prime Minister of Pakistan, in this regard, has made a special representative whose name is Shahzain Bukti. Shahzain Bukti is son of late Sardar Bukti, who was being assassinated in the time of President Musharraf, who was a dictator in Pakistan. And this Shahzain Bukti is a rival to his cousin, who's Brahmdas Bukti, who's an insurgent, who's a declared insurgent, and who declares the support of India. And since he is stationed in Geneva, so he has been recruiting all of these insurgencies groups and insurgent activities in Pakistan. So Shahzain Bukti, who's a rival of Brahmdas Bukti, he has become a special assistant to Prime Minister. In all this process, again, the provincial government, which was an ally of federal government, has not been taken on board. So you see, there is a gap again when it comes down to reconciliation. And this is not the first time that government has outlined any reconciliation, any rehabilitation process for these insurgents in Gwadar. And there were times when it was announced under Pakistan People's Party's government. It was a time of 2008 to 2013 when they announced a reconciliation program for insurgents, and they announced NFC budget. Then, under the regime of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif from 2013 to 2016, again there was a reconciliation effort, but all the stakeholders, the gap which is evident, which is still there, is that all the stakeholders are never taken on board. So at the local level, these complexities are there, and they just alienate the local parties, the local communities, and that's the real problem. And if we move forward from Gwadar to Afghanistan and to Uzbekistan, if we go towards the motorways and all of the proposed railway and the proposed routes and transits to connect the region, we see that these are the areas which have communities with active ethnic and identity politics. And unless they are addressed, any strategic plan, any political plan, any economic plan cannot culminate into something productive. So at local level, there is required an active policy making in which all the stakeholders requires to come on board collectively, and then probably it would pay off.
Thank you, Aisha. I'd like to give our other panelists an opportunity to respond to my initial question as well, or anything else that they would like to respond to, and then we have a few audience questions that have come in, which I will get to next.
I wouldn't mind jumping onto the localized features or characteristics that have, in the case of Chabahar, just 2 or 3 points. One, just given how the governance structure is, and the ethnic breakdown of Chabahar, which is located in the Sistan of Balochistan, essentially the Baloch part, and the same population across the border. It's generally these provinces are managed top down from Tehran, so it's not the ethnic, the local population that administer any structures or governance of any sort. It's sort of managed from Tehran, and having been there, it's very visible. That's how it's managed, and it's of course underdeveloped. Unemployment is huge. In fact, when President Rouhani sort of comes in his second term, because that's when this project picks up, that's a language he uses in rallies in Chabahar, essentially. And that dynamic has not changed for the Iranian domestic economy, right? You have Ibrahim Raisi coming in as president now because of the domestic economic problems and the reform that has not happened, given that Iran has lost all of its petrochemical and oil-related revenue and jobs, etc. So that's the crisis it's having, and that's where this port could make a possible positive impact as well. Just a final point again, mirroring Aisha's points again on security and how it works in this border region between Iran and Pakistan is you essentially previously had a terrorist group that was called the Jundullah, which was then re-avatar. It became the second avatar of it. It's called Geopolitical, which is still active, and they basically harbored in the Pakistani side, and they attacked the Iranian border forces. And you have had a couple of terror strikes in the last few years alone. So it's also an area that is a bit unstable if that activity increases. And I think the Afghan scenario, the changes now, definitely worrying all of the countries that are invested in this region.
Yeah, if I could just add a couple points here. You see this porous border between Iran and Pakistan, and the same is the manner with Afghanistan via Chaman border. You see, these insurgent groups have been looking for these safe havens in Iran and in Afghanistan. And with the US withdrawal and with Taliban taking over, that's probably is taken as a positive thing in Pakistan. And we are looking at it from a perspective that, yes, now these insurgents would be cleansed up because Taliban would not compromise on them. And probably this border security issues would be resolved.
This sort of dovetails with a question we've received from the audience, and would like to give our other panelists an opportunity to respond to either this question or kind of go back to sort of the local level stakeholders. But that's the question of, obviously, sort of on everyone's minds right now is the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and sort of rising Taliban kind of overdrive in the country. So perhaps, Soraya, if you would like to start, but kind of thinking through how the current situation in Afghanistan and rising political instability impacts each of these projects. You look at one that goes specifically through Afghanistan, but a number of these also connect via Afghanistan to Central Asia. So how does this impact the prospects of each project, and potentially how does the question of who's negotiating in some of these projects, as we've seen with TAPI, both the Afghan government and the Taliban have discussed this project with Turkmenistan. So what implications does that have for sort of legitimacy and kind of questions of who the sort of main overseer of these projects is for the future? So Soraya, if you would like to start, but also feel free to respond to the local level stakeholders question or respond to other things our panelists have said thus far.
Yeah, of course. So I think with obviously the recent news that have been coming out, the Taliban have definitely been increasing their control over the different parts of Afghanistan. The central government is still maintaining a stronghold over the major capital and the surrounding cities. However, the Taliban have been increasing their power, so they've been increasingly involved in the negotiations. When it comes to the TAPI pipeline, even very recently, they have indicated their support, and they have stated that they will not be blocking it or posing as a hindrance to the project. So I think that's definitely positive news. However, what we do see with insurgent groups is that the central leader may say one thing, but on the ground realities when it comes to security issues may be another, as many of the local areas are led by commanders. So I think that's definitely going to be something that we have to wait and watch. And I think that is also going to be the stance that a lot of the other countries in the region do have. India particularly does have a wait and watch policy to see what will be occurring in Afghanistan. And it's going to be kind of building off their relationship with Afghanistan from there. So of course, the Taliban are part of the negotiations in these projects. They have indicated their support for the economic projects in the country, which, especially if they're increasing their control over the area, would also benefit them. However, how these insurgent groups will be negotiating with the government and whether they will be able to maintain the security to the point where they can continue maintaining the project is still up for discussion, and we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out.
And responses from any other panelists just on connection via Afghanistan. Aisha, I know you discussed in your article kind of challenges of border closures that has and that impact on using Gwadar or using CPEC as a broader regional kind of transport mechanism. So I don't know if you would like to comment on how this might impact.
Yeah, of course. So these developing situations of Taliban taking over, and then while sitting in Pakistan, I know for a fact that we have 3 porous openings, gateways, which is one Chaman, one Turkam, and then we have this corridor of Bahan, which has been already taken by Taliban. So these developing situations are giving rise to I see a revival of geopolitics again. Although when I say geopolitics, I'm referring to the competition going on, the geostrategic competition going on between China and United States of America. But I see a clear void being left out by the withdrawal of the forces, and how Taliban are going to use it. Taliban have now become such an asset here that every party is trying to take them into their team, and India has investment in Afghanistan, so they have their stakes there. Pakistan has the regional stability, the strategic stability stake there in Afghanistan. Iran has the same concern. All of the transit of Uzbekistan depends on Afghanistan. So you see, this strategic location of Afghanistan is crucial for all of the regional partners. And we are still looking forward that how Taliban are going to maneuver that. But let's see that who has the leverage here. it is still to be decided. It's going to be a very interesting situation if it's going to be India, if it's going to be Pakistan, or we are going to, for maybe for one time, this region comes together and they play Taliban as one threat and they maneuver against it. That's an opportunity as well, which is existing. So I see a lot of fluctuating situations, and anything can happen. We can expect a lot.
Thank you, Aisha and Soraya. So moving sort of into the sort of bigger geopolitical picture, so these projects are often promoted for economic interconnectivity, as you have all discussed in your analysis, but there's also a geostrategic angle to them, which each of you have looked at as well. So for all panelists, my question is whether gaps in the aims for the project and the kind of actual progress on the ground have impacted relationships between countries that are involved, and to what extent has geopolitical competition in the region impacted the scope or aims for each of these projects? Navard, perhaps if you would like to start us off, and would also be interested in hearing from you, since you are looking at such a massive infrastructure project that involves so many countries, to what extent does sort of competition between countries involved impact sort of prospects for the INSTC?
Well, thank you for that. To begin with, as I mentioned, it was founded in 2012, so a lot of time has passed since then. And the project has been moving on really slowly because of a number of bottlenecks and obstacles. It is, as you said, really a massive project which involves various not only countries, but various regions. And unlike the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been created, pushed forward, and actually financed to some extent by China, that was this bigger leading country that was doing that. That's why it was very successful, I believe. Unlike this project, the INSTC has been largely financed by various regional development banks, and it has been financed through the member states. So it has been progressing in an ad hoc manner mostly, rather than with a centralized planning. I think this was one of the main obstacles, that it got really too long to build it, and also because it runs through so many different countries, it has a lot of security issues impacting it at the same time. You mentioned Afghanistan, and that's one of the issues that can sort of impact the actual realization of the project, because the many conflicts and the many security issues you have along the way while moving freight and the transportation, and it's about also security of the supply chain. So all this affects the project itself, and it makes it less competitive, and especially if there is an increased conflict in those zones, it's going to discourage investment. So the investment is key now in having this project accomplished in a way. At the same time, it has been pushed forward by the member states because there is an increased interest, unlike a couple of years ago when some time ago it was almost frozen, but recently it has been revived. And also, as for the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, of course, there is a convergence of interests between the US and India, that Afghanistan is more stable. And when we're speaking about Chabahar, there is another argument to it, that it's going to increase India's role in Afghanistan, and it's also going to allow Afghanistan to be included in India's development projects to the extent that it's possible in this scenario. So all these things are interconnected, and it's really, I think it's too early to say the extent to which the situation in Afghanistan is going to impact this project, because the US withdrawal is just happening, and there are factors like India and Pakistan and China competition, as well as the recent news about Turkey going to take to play some role in securing the airport in Afghanistan. So this is going to be like a major interplay of different interests. We'll have to wait and see what comes out of it.
Sumita, perhaps if you would like to respond next with anything on Chabahar or.
Sure. A couple of things related to both India and Iran, right? Since they're both equally important when Chabahar comes into play. But as Nawad mentioned, so India has, I think when you think about the Taliban returning to power, India has had to deal with the Taliban and just problems on the ground and regarding infrastructure development in Afghanistan itself. So it's had at least a decade since the Dilaram-Zaranj highway that it built in Afghanistan, which gets it to the Iranian border. And then the Iranians have developed their route to Chabahar from the bordering Zaranj, right next to Zabul, which is the Iranian town on that side, and connecting that to Chabahar. So India's had some experience on the Afghan side having to maintain and what has happened to its infrastructure when they targeted their officers who are working on it, etc. So it's quite familiar with how this can go. And I think it also shows the urgency, and not just for India, but the region, when you have the Indian foreign minister right now at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting where they're discussing Afghanistan along with China, Russia, Pakistan, everyone in the room. And then he heads off by the end of the week to Uzbekistan, which is hosting this connectivity conference to get everyone talking about this, about these different networks and ports, etc. In the backdrop of this happening. So clearly it's the, as even Aisha said, the thing that's on their minds in the entire region. Specifically on just, India-Iran dynamics, as I mentioned, yes, when the gap was widening between what the actual vision was and how, because of sanctions and et cetera, and just, back and forth and trying to figure out the contracts and, the specifics of the project, and when things were not working as smoothly or as fast as Iran would have liked. I mean, there have been many moments when, there would be public sort of frustration expressed, to make news, and then you move on to the next cycle. But it's sort of a dynamic that's actually existed in the relationship. We don't hear about it as much. It's always spoken of, like India and Iran have the civilizational great, you have the history, but when you look at how they do business with each other, especially on the economic side, it's been tough. Now on the political and security, of course, there's been a lull, but they have collaborated again to overthrow the Taliban, right? But since then, Iran has harbored, sort of understood, negotiated with the Taliban, and still is. In fact, Jaishankar, the foreign minister, did make a quick pit stop just 3 days ago in Tehran for that when Iran was hosting a Taliban delegation as well. So I think the local dynamics, it's where India is again talking or have decided to talk to the Taliban. The Taliban have expressed interest as well. And it's also, Iran is sort of a conduit to sort of keep those that conversation started and going as well. So that's where the local, I think, interdynamics between the two countries are right now.
And Aisha, Soraya, curious to hear also your thoughts as well about whether challenges sort of implementing these projects on the ground have led to any challenges in sort of the broader geopolitical relationships that the projects are sort of symbolic of, whether that's TAPI, which is quite an interesting project in that it involves both Pakistan and India, or the China-Pakistan relationship in regards to CPEC and other projects.
Yeah, you say, shall I go first, Raya? Yeah, thank you. So you see, regarding the geopolitical ties between China and Pakistan, we have various situations actually. To summarize it, we can put it into two bands. One is the Quad and the other is anti-Quad. So I'm looking at this geopolitical competition from this Quad and anti-Quad equation. So we have two bands clearly. In this situation, I see one major participant of South Asia on its nerve right now, which is India, which is trying to concentrate to get all the possible support, and it is trying to, as Sumita said, that it is trying to emphasize on this point that how are we supposed to bring back all the investment to Chabahar, because this geopolitical competition essentially is working in the situation of Quad and anti-Quad. We have forces of United States of America and China, so all this falls under this equation for me.
Yeah, and just to build off Aisha's points, I think in order to understand the geopolitical nature of the region, we also have to specifically look at the projects and the interests that are underlying there, because the response of a state to each project will be different depending on how big their interests within that area lay. So for the TAPI pipeline, Turkmenistan really wants to diversify their own energy market. The country has been highly concentrated in one export destination. So before it was Russia and now it's China. In 2019, I think it was approximately 30 BCM, which is about 90% of their natural gas were sent to China. So the TAPI pipeline actually offers a way for the region to actually not include Russia and China and kind of lower the influence that they have by having this pipeline that connects these four countries. So Afghanistan also benefits at the same time by the transit fees and being that conduit between the states. Pakistan and India, similar interests. They get to diversify their own energy markets because of their domestic energy hungry market. And the US and the EU also want to promote this pipeline, again, as it lowers that Russia and China influence in the region. So I think that the pipeline and other economic projects with politics produce such an interesting relationship as they can, and many politicians have stated that they can promote or they can at the same time be more hostile with one another. However, with the situation with the TAPI pipeline specifically, it has been brought people to the negotiating table, having the conversations. The Taliban have also been included. They've also shared their support. So I'm hopeful as of right now in that it is getting closer to building it, regardless of the numerous delays that have occurred.
Thank you, Soraya. And this sort of pairs nicely with a couple of questions that we've received from the audience, which is, in light of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, do you anticipate other powers in the region, including China and Russia, sort of stepping up involvement in South and Central Asia? So I'll let anyone who wants to start go ahead. Aisha, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. So I see that Chinese are already in negotiations with Taliban, and they're trying to bring them to the table of economic stability of the region. So if they get Taliban invested into this equation, which is economic and strategic both, it would be a win-win situation. So China is definitely extending its global footprint, and South Asia is another region in that. So I see that, yes, China is filling up that void. Russia, yes. Russia, again, is following, but Nwad and Surya would be more enlightened on that. But I think that, yeah, China is definitely filling up the void and extending the maximum footprint it can get in the region.
If I could just jump in, because Iran is interestingly the case of a country at this point that did, and also reason why it held out on, on Chabahar to give it to India was primarily to not be over-reliant on China, because it saw that trajectory coming for itself. Because, from 2005-06 with different sanctions, then, the EU sanctions from 2009, US 9-10, and then on, just piling on, that's when Chinese influence, that's when that grip tightened. And so from the time it was relaxed a little bit from 2015, the Iranians were only more than happy to actually wait and get India on board, because if you look at the timeline, how slow things were, you would expect, and it's true. I mean, China did make a lot of suggestions and overtures to get moving on the same project as well at the same time around 2015, but Iran chose not to let that happen. Additionally, also, I flag in the piece because it's important to understand when it comes to looking at Gwadar and Chabahar as these competing similar objects. I find them very dissimilar in specifically a couple of ways, and that's because of the relationship that India and Iran has, and how China-Pakistan dynamic is, the power dynamics, the patronage, very vastly different, and it has to be taken on board. Two, just on the leases that they're at, right? So you have Gwadar, which is a 40+ odd year, project that China has control of. India technically has a 10-year, build, operate, transfer, like a very standard operation plan that it has to do with Chabahar, which hasn't really kicked off. They're on a short-term contract now with an Iranian firm operating. And we were supposed to hear by June this year of the extension and getting those 10 years on. So we'll have to wait for that, but it's assumed that it will be renewed and India has those 10 years. But even in that time, it can't really call the shots on what passes through the port. That's not how this is working, which is why I think it's an interesting situation where you have Indian goods, Pakistani goods, Chinese goods will have to be moved through there if the money has to be made, right? So that's something I wanted to flag. I think it's just some of the differences in how Iran and India, they operate.
Yeah, if I could just add in. So Sumita said that there's the specific dynamics of Chabahar and Gwadar, and this dynamics essentially falls into the equation of China-Pakistan relation and India-Iran relation. So you see that in this competition, I see an active competition between China and India. So it goes up to India if it lives up to this competition or not. Since China is working with Iran now, it did not work in the earlier stages. And Gwadar is, I think Gwadar started after 2015 operating, right? The first phase started after 2015. So China's space has been a lot more greater than what India has maneuvered upon in Chabahar or in Iran. So I think that this dynamics of India and China rivalry would also impact the development of Chabahar and its competition with Gwadar, because China is on the hold of Iranian sites as well. So we have to factor this in.
Navarre, Soraya, any responses on your end? Navarre, would you like to respond? Or
sorry. Yeah, sure. As for Russia, obviously Russia is not interested in any major conflict erupting in Afghanistan. And also considering that Afghanistan is bordering Tajikistan, which is the member state of Eurasian Economic Union, Russia is kind of wary about this border clashes that are happening or the possibility of some tensions on the border. And that's not what Russia really wants to happen in the region, and is interested mostly in stability. So that has been like the main Russian official position. But as to whether the presence of Russia will be increased in Afghanistan after the US withdrawal, it's really hard to say at the moment. So this much.
Then the next question is just sort of on these projects and potential implications for soft power, and whether there is kind of soft power potential with how these projects are portrayed. One interesting note, Navarre, that you had was that a lot of the INSTC projects are often more ad hoc or managed through local governments. So do they have any sort of prospects for Russian soft power in the region, or are they kind of viewed more through the lens of projects under the auspices of individual countries? Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, I think, Aisha, as you know, in your analysis, is that a lot of projects have been sort of grouped under the umbrella of CPAC, where their funding actually might come from other sources, but are they sort of looped into this bigger picture CPAC project? So I'd be curious to hear potentially from each panelist just about the implications that projects have for soft power projection in the region, if there are any, or if this is something that's being done successfully. Navarre, perhaps if you would like to start, does INSTC have prospects for Russian soft power, or is it sort of more of these kind of ad hoc separate projects?
I wouldn't say that Russia has been projecting really strong soft power through INSTC, because I believe Russia has been more putting emphasis on the economic aspect of it. Like in Armenia, for instance, it's Russia has strong presence in terms of its infrastructure projects and railways. And I think Russia is mostly viewing it as an economic tool to have leverage and to have influence in the region. Of course, if whenever there is a connectivity project, it's not just about economics, it's not just about trade, it also is about a lot of interrelated issues that come along, such as the increased Russian presence, for instance, in the countries that it's having an impact on. But in this case, I would not say that it is a projection of Russia's soft power abroad. Also, because of the factor that I mentioned, that the countries are trying to find the funding not from Russia as like the main donor, but from different various sources, and it also impacts even as some of the project sections in Armenia have been financed by China, which is an interesting thing, or by the European Union. So it's more like the convergence of interests that matters, and where the interests of the investors align. And there is a lot of alignment in that section, for instance, because it's in one way we can view it as a competition, but in another way, there is like common interests in having these roads built. So there are different investors, and it's hard to determine it as just one route.
Thank you, Navard. Would like to open this just to other panelists as well.
Yeah, I actually have to comment on this. If we talk about the soft power perception, or if the China could appease the local communities of CPAC areas, and if they could convince them, I can say that although CPAC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is celebrated well when the idea of prosperity and idea of progress and idea of industrialization, and since we are in this midterm phase, which concerns itself with poverty alleviation and agricultural and industrial development, so we see that a lot of launching of special economic zones in Peshawar, in Gwadar, in Sindh, in central Punjab. But when it comes down to the question that do we actually agree while dealing with Chinese, do we actually have this support towards the Chinese which are coming to Pakistan for working, that's still something which Pakistanis frowned upon. I can safely say that. And there is insecurity among the masses when it comes down to when it comes down to relying upon China or Chinese development. So CPAC, yes, we agree on that, and we celebrate it, and we see it as a way forward. But China and Chinese, well, it's still, they're working on it through a lot of humanitarian efforts like educational programs, but it's still not part of the popular culture, maybe. That's why the consent or the soft power image or the discourse power or perception power is still lacking. So they have to work on it, and they are working on it actually.
So talking about, moving on to like the Chabahar side of things and the India-Iran relationship before coming to the soft power part, is that just on people-to-people ties, it's really weak. You have around 4,000 odd Indians in Iran, while across the Persian Gulf and the Gulf, the GCC states, you have 8 million of them. So that just by itself, you just know how much the peoples are actually interacting and how much businesses are flowing this way and that. And Iran and India tried when the thaw after the 2015-16 window arrived. I mean, they did try to get businesses going, but it's still, India's exports are mainly rice, tea, pharmaceuticals, but and heavily, it was lopsided in the sense of the oil that was, that flooded in the other way into India from Iran. And they've just not been able to correct that, imbalance either with the sanctions. And of late, earlier this year, it was reported that they essentially do not have any non-oil trade happening either. So, on the trade side, on the people-to-people front side, it's been really weak, which is why this project is also important just on the diversification of that relationship and building some other aspects to it. And in that sense, and because of just how much other people thinking of each other across, I mean, that's really not happening in terms of is India, funding or cooperating with different local government bodies in Iran, not really either. So this is quite very specifically, project central and discussing it and working through the Iranian conduits that's present there.
All right, well, thank you all. We are actually at about 10 o'clock, so out of time. Apologies if I was not able to get to your questions from the audience, but you can email me at bshukrit@stimson.org, and I'll make sure to bring them to the panelists as well. This has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank each of our panelists for joining this morning, as well as their analysis on South Asian voices, which you can read now. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day for everyone joining from the US, and a wonderful evening for all in South Asia and across the world who joined. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank